So far, Quine has introduced a puzzle, the puzzle of reference to non-existent objects, or apparently non-existent objects, and proposed a solution. The solution being to move the subject term, the apparently referring subject term, into predicate position. And that far, Quine is just more or less following what Russell says in undenoting. At this point, Quine deviates from Russell, and we get a sort of the beginning of Quine's own view. So remember the end of the dialectic last time. We have McX and Wyman saying like, look, yeah, Quine, you've shown us that Pegasus, you can solve the problem that Pegasus doesn't exist, but it looks like you're still committed to the existence of a property being Pegasus. So although you don't have to have the noun Pegasus, Pegasus is an object that exists, you have to have the property being Pegasus, Pegasus as a property that exists. And McX will say, so let's consider properties. Clearly there are red houses, red shirts, red sunsets, and so on and so forth. If you're saying that Pegasus is like those, you're saying Pegasus exists. Now, McX is going to push this idea that there are properties. McX says these things, the red houses, red sunsets, and so on and so forth, all have something in common. So clearly there is the property redness. That is, the property redness exists. So here's the argument. Red houses, shirts, and sunsets all exist. If that's right, then redness exists. Therefore, redness exists, redness being a property at this point. And Quine replies and says, I accept that there are red houses, red shirts, and red sunsets, but I deny that that entails that redness exists. And Quine is in fact going to deny that redness exists. He's not just going to say that this argument for the existence of the property redness is unsound. He's going to say there is no such property. And he's going to say a similar thing about the property being Pegasus. That all of these objects are red doesn't require that there is something in addition to the object themselves. That is, the word houses, roses, and sunsets denote each of many individual entities, which are houses and roses and sunsets. And the word red and red object denote various individuals, which are red houses, red roses, red sunsets, red objects, and so on and so forth. But there is not, in addition to the entities out there, that is, in addition to the red house and the red sunset, any entity whatsoever, individual or otherwise, which is named by the word redness, nor, for that matter, by the word househood, rosehood, and sunsethood. So one way you can think of Quine's point here is this. He's saying that red, the color red is just the set of the objects that are red. Whereas someone who thinks there's a property redness thinks that the property redness is something separate from the individuals that are in fact red. You might think of that property as a Platonic form. You might think of it as a sense that inhabits the third realm. There's other ways to think about it too. But the point is, Quine is contrasting his view with the view on which redness is an abstract entity. His view is that redness is a concrete entity, and it's not something that is separate from or exists as distinct from the individual red things. Redness for Quine is just the set of red things. That the houses and roses and sunsets are all of them taken to be red may be taken as an irreducible, ultimate and irreducible. And it may be held that McX is no better off in point of real explanatory power for all the occult entities which he posits under the names such as redness. Now, it might not be clear what's going on here in this point in the dialectic. I'm not sure if it comes through or not to someone without relevant background. But in case it doesn't, here's what's going on. McX, kind of like Plato with his forms, is thinking that positing the property of redness explains something that needs explained. That is, McX thinks that red houses and red sunsets have something in common. In order to explain that commonality, you need to posit a property and say what they have in common is that they both instantiate a property, or if you're Plato, they both share in the form redness. Quine is saying positing that property doesn't really explain anything. It doesn't really explain what they have in common. We can just take it as a brute fact that we categorize things in certain ways, that we point at a red house and we call it red, and we point at a red sunset and we call it red. It's not a fact that needs explained. It's sort of just a fact about our psychology that we do this. So Quine denies that if there are red houses, red sunsets, and so on, that redness exists, because he denies that you need to do the explanatory work, or at least that positing properties can do the explanatory work of explaining the commonality between red houses, red sunsets, and red shirts, and so on. Okay, and here's a question. Just sort of a discussion question, something to think about. Does positing the property redness really go no way at all to explaining why red houses, red shirts, and sunsets belong in the same group? That is, in the group of red things. you might think it does. You might think saying, look, red house and red sunset are both called red because they have a property in common, the property of redness. So it explains, for example, why we're disposed to call them the same thing, why our perceptual system treats them as similar, and so on and so forth. Now, McX continues and says, but you agree that we can meaningfully use the predicate is red, so you think is red names the property redness. And Quine says, no, we've already seen that meaningfulness is one thing and naming is another. Just as Pegasus can be meaningful within a sentence, even though there is no Pegasus, is red can be meaningful within a sentence, even though there is no redness. And what I want you to think about this move for a second. So what Quine is doing is he's basically saying, look, you thought Pegasus had to refer to something because, you know, the sentence Pegasus was birthed from Medusa's head is meaningful. But I showed you it doesn't have to refer to anything just because that sentence is meaningful. And similarly, says Quine, even if predicate terms don't refer to anything, sentences with predicate terms, like that house is red, can be meaningful. And what I want you to think about is whether this move is acceptable. So Quine claims to show that sentences with Pegasus as subject can be meaningful even if Pegasus doesn't exist because, despite appearances, Pegasus is a predicate, being the flying horse, not a subject. Insofar as this is satisfying, you might think, it is satisfying because we still have a referent for Pegasus, namely the property being red, or the property being namely the property being a flying horse. But now Quine is claiming a more general divide between naming and meaning. He's saying these terms not only do they not name objects, they don't even name properties. And then one wonders how you can say, okay, the sentence is still meaningful. Now, McX isn't going to take that route. He's going to protest differently. He's going to say, but you're invoking meanings, and meanings are something. They are, moreover, something abstract. They are, in fact, properties. And Quine here is going to say meanings aren't properties. In fact, I deny that there are even meanings. I don't think that there are properties. I don't think that there are meanings. Instead, I think some statements are meaningful and others aren't. So a statement isn't meaningful in virtue of having a meaning, as if there's something it possesses that makes it meaningful. It's meaningful in virtue of something else. And McX is going to press on that and say, but how can statements be meaningful if there are no meanings? Isn't being meaningful having a meaning? And Quine says, no. What makes a statement meaningful isn't it having a meaning, where meaning is some sort of thing. What makes a statement meaningful is the practices that surround it. That has to do with human behavior, not some abstract realm of meanings. So for Quine, a statement's meaning is basically the same as the behaviors it is typically elicited by and that it typically elicits. So if you're at all familiar with behaviorism in philosophy of mind, which says that mental entities like beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, and pains, and so on, are just behaviors, not that they cause behaviors, but that they are behaviors, that they are nothing but behaviors. This is like that view, but about meanings. For Quine, meanings are just collections of behaviors. Okay, we'll stop this video there and continue next time with an aside.